Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us, and welcome to this month's edition of Leaf Surgery, or as we're increasingly calling it, Leaf Digs Deeper. And we're digging deeper today into climate smart dairy. We're really pleased to have our speakers join us, introduced to which I'll give you in a moment. But as a reminder, we're recording today's session and we'll be able to access it on YouTube and an audio version as well. And any questions, please pop those in the chat and we can post those to the speakers. As we often start many of our series and our discussions, the direction of travel of the agriculture industry, both UK-centred and globally, is very much set. And we're seeing an increasing pressure on producers and growers to increase and improve environmental outcomes and to document that as well. And we're seeing that pressure come from various stakeholders through the industry and really an increase in consumer awareness, which in itself raises some interesting questions and some interesting points around consumer understanding and their willingness to pay, and also how particular sectors of the industry. Yes.
Sorry, your audio's gone a bit horrible.
Oh, sorry about that. It will be.
I have to start again.
Yeah. How's that, Zoe? Is that any better? Thumbs up, or otherwise, or is it still a bit patchy? Sorry, everyone. I was just explaining to Zoe and Sven, just a bit of background. Leaf's moved into new offices, and this is our first day as a team here. So inevitably, we're going to have some technical challenges. But just to recap on that side of things, we're finding all areas and sectors of the industry are under increasing pressure really to improve environmental outcomes and stewardship, whilst also maintaining production with an eye on food security. And dairy as a sector is not immune from that. And we find that pressure coming from multiple parts of the industry, from multiple stakeholders, and consumer awareness really, and demands are also increasing, which brings in some interesting discussion points around the level of understanding from different consumer sectors and also their willingness to pay for those things as well. So we're really pleased to have Dr. Zoe Barker join us from the University of Reading. Zoe lectures in animal sciences, specific areas of interest around behaviour and welfare, and we're going to talk a little bit about some of the outcomes from the SmartDairy project. And then Dr. Sven Koops as well is Farms Manager at the University of Reading. Farm looks after both the commercial dairy herd, the Centre for Dairy Research, and also the Crop Research Unit. So he's going to bring a great deal of experience on the ground and also from different geographies as well. So I'm going to just start by allowing Zoe first to introduce yourself, a little bit more detail on your background, and also a little bit on the SmartDairy project, and then we'll hand over to Sven for the same thing.
Thanks, Dan. As Dan said, I'm at Reading University, and my background has really sort of come from the sort of epidemiology of health and welfare of dairy cattle. So I spent a significant amount of time looking at lameness in dairy cattle. That kind of transitioned across to the utilization of precision livestock tools and different sensors, novel sensors for tracking different health conditions, including lameness. And in the process of doing that, we also did some work. Well, we also made some observations while we were doing that our cows were doing some quite maladaptive behaviours in the barns, and that we were able to then pick this up, that were associated with heat stress in dairy cattle. So I've had a kind of one part of my role associated with that, and then I came into contact with Leaf because as I moved across from where I was to Reading, I started my life on the Diverse Foragers project, which was a long-term project looking at the utilisation of multi-species swards across livestock operations. So I spent a bit of time crossing paths with various Leaf members on that and doing things. This most recent project is called the SmartDairy project. It was actually an EU funded project. It's one of these strange partnership calls where overarching is the EU, but it was funded in the UK by DEFRA, and each country was funded by their own funding party. And we had partners in Finland, Ireland, and Italy as well, looking at different aspects around the culture of food, what consumers are eating, and dairy alternatives, and all that sort of thing. Sort of policy and business models, and supply chain side of things from the Italians, and the Irish were interested in assessing the feasibility of carbon marketing, and they had an aim to try and set up some living labs to do that work, which interestingly wasn't quite as successful as they'd hoped. So in the UK, our aim was to look at consumers' perceptions and their willingness to pay for innovations which would be associated with climate smart dairying. So ultimately trying to reduce methane and CO2 emissions from dairy sector. Is that enough of intro for the minute? And we'll get into a little bit more of the nitty-gritty later.
That is brilliant. Thank you, Zoe. And you already touched on a point, I think, that might warrant some further explanation. So we talk about climate smart dairy, and we sort of think of that in terms of the impact of those dairy systems on the environment. But actually, you talk about there in terms of some of your future work of the impact of the environment on those dairy systems.
Yeah.
And particularly on the welfare aspects of the cattle. So that, that's a whole discussion point in itself, but hopefully we can touch on that as well. So we'll come back onto some of the smart dairy outputs. But Sven, could I hand over to you for a quick intro on yourself and background, and then the area of work that you're involved in now, please?
Yeah. Thanks, Dan. Just not a major correction, but you mentioned that I was in charge of CEDAR as well as the commercial operations and CRU. That's not quite the case. I very closely collaborate with both of those units, but it's more of a leadership on the commercial farm side. But we obviously directly feed into the CEDAR research side, and as such, very close collaboration is quite important. In terms of my own background, I have been professionally farming, I think, for the last 16, 17 years, rather than my entire lifetime, but I have a degree in agriculture. I have a PhD in agribusiness. And I guess in the last 15 years, I've been exposed to several farming systems, geographically quite dispersed. So this is from between New Zealand, the northeast of Germany, as well as the UK. I've worked in different farming systems, and the two main ones in the dairy, of course, the TMR system, which is probably represented globally more than 80% of total milk production, but also grazing systems back in New Zealand. These were block calving systems. I think what the perspective that I'm predominantly bringing is an operational one. But a lot of the operational things that happen on farm, if they are designed effectively and efficiently, taking advantage of the latest technologies, mitigating mechanisms, data collection, they all help and support the drive and more sustainability, whatever aspect that may be. I mean, we are talking very much at the moment about methane emissions, carbon footprints. I think there's a lot already happening that if farmers would adopt these technologies or these practices, that a lot is already going into that direction. Of course, this is all underpinned and also supported by research and a lot of effort, obviously, coming from CEDAR and the University of Reading. But I can see that online. I have a former colleague of mine from SIUC, John Newbold. So I think this is a multidisciplinary as well as a multi-institutional approach to finding solutions. That's a little bit background and a little bit of what I'm doing. I'm looking after the commercial herd here. Our main purpose, of course, is to supply research animals to the research team. But a big objective of mine is obviously to facilitate research. And often you find that commercial efficiency objectives can be or are traded off in order to achieve certain research objectives. I see my role very much in trying to minimize trade-offs and optimize across both aspects, because as a farm, we have to be commercially viable, and as a signpost within the industry, we cannot be artificial in the respect that we are a dairy farm that simply is there for research. I think we need to fulfill both objectives. That is to show that what we do and what we support is actually pointing into a future that helps all dairy farmers.
Thank you, Sven. So there's clearly some international perspective there, which is great, but also you address that point very early on, that whilst you are involved in the research elements to it, that really only has value if it's something we can broaden out to the wider industry, and that's really where the role is. Zoe, it'd be good to come back to you and just talk a little bit about some of those stakeholder opinions that you identified as part of your research. So with respect to the sort of performance of the dairy sector in terms of climate, I know you spoke to farmers and you sought the opinion of consumers as well. It'd be great to learn a little bit more about what you found in those elements of the project.
You're muted, Zoe.
Mute again.
Perfect.
Always. Yeah, so we had it's quite a complicated and convoluted project that kind of linked back to itself in various points in time. So the starting point was some industry stakeholder meetings. So this was a collaboration between Bristol, Sussex, and Reading. So Sussex were very much the economics and willingness to pay side of things, with Bristol and ourselves offering the support in terms of engaging with stakeholders and keeping the economists on track and understanding what the stakeholders were saying. So we started with a group of industry stakeholder meetings. So we had two down in the southwest, one at CEDAR and one at Stoneleigh Park, and had various different people representing the industry. And as you can imagine, the representation varied across the different parts. So we had a little bit more of the sort of grass-based dairy systems in the southwest, and more of the more intensive, larger scale, more TMR indoor house-based systems in the Midlands, as well as various allied industries in terms of feed reps, some producers, so things like Rodders, Clotted Cream participated, and various other stakeholders were involved. So the main purpose of those meetings was to understand what the farmers were doing already in terms of things which might align with being more smart and savvy in terms of climate outputs, and also to know what they were aware of but maybe weren't doing themselves for various reasons, and also things that they were aware of might be coming in the future and that were of interest, but again they weren't yet doing. And this created a list of about 70 different individual specific innovations. So we couldn't really take 70 things forwards to a bunch of consumers because they would have been totally bamboozled and wouldn't have understood any of them anyway. So we sort of themed them a little bit and kind of grouped them together into about 10 different innovations, which were things along the lines of maybe things related to better fertilizer management and optimizing use of diverse foragers and feeding related. So those kind of themes is how we started to group things together. And we did an initial set of consumer stakeholder meetings. So also from those industry ones, the farmers were very, very skeptical about what the consumer understood, and whether they would actually understand any of the things that we were presenting to them and things, because we asked them to grade those innovations in terms of the how beneficial, how how likely they were to have impact, how easy they were to have a how easy they were to implement, what the cost implications were, and then other ones like would the consumers think about them? And they largely kind of thought the consumers wouldn't really understand most of them. So we went to the consumers, and they probably weren't wrong. The consumers had limited understanding about it. So these were groups of not the most representative group of consumers. There were sort of at the University of Sussex, so there was some international students, there were some staff, there were some kind of local residents, and they had very varied kind of approaches to dairy consumption. So in some ways, they were representative of dairy consumers because some of them were drinking whatever came across their path. Some of them were more fussy about whether they chose to do organic milk and not conventional milk. Some of them were being selective about using dairy alternatives for specific reasons, but they didn't like them for all reasons. So maybe they would like a dairy alternative in their coffee, but they didn't want it in their cheese. Those kind of things. So they were sort of mixed in that respect. And they were largely receptive and interested in the innovations when they were explained to them what they did and what their purpose was. The only one where we had very mixed and stronger opinions was when we presented the idea of methane mitigation from the cow. So we presented the fact that you could, in theory, capture methane by enclosing a barn and having the cows in the barn the entire time and capturing the methane that way. They didn't like that idea. Or they were very mixed about that idea. Some people thought it was fine, some people thought it was very not fine. They were very mixed about the idea of technologies that captured methane by wearing something around the nose to capture the methane while they were out in the pasture. So putting cows outside, but still capturing the methane, that wasn't okay because they didn't want them to wear a head collar. And they also were mixed about the idea of adding things to feed. Even though there are various different things that we do already with respect to dairy feed, and there are various supplements that help to make the feed more efficient and therefore reduce methane by that route. They were very nervous and mixed about that. So we then took that information and we grouped all of those innovations into 3 bundles. Because to be able to do any meaningful statistical analysis, 10 groups of innovations was still too many. So our 3 bundles were broadly titled nature-based innovations. So those were the ones that centered around increasing carbon capture from soil and minimizing outputs, minimizing the use of things like soya, imported soya with unknown environmental consequences elsewhere, optimizing things like using diverse forages to minimize fertilizer use. Those kind of innovations were all grouped together. We then had another bundle which had the innovations that kind of optimize efficiency and therefore reduce the greenhouse gas equivalents per unit of output. So that included precision livestock farming techniques, optimization of breeding through genomic selection, and other technologies and efficiencies that the farmers might put in. So more efficient use of fertilizers, precision application techniques, those kind of things were all grouped together. And then we had our methane, the reduction of emissions bundle, which included emissions from slurry and emissions from the cow directly themselves. So anything related to those we sort of grouped together. in a separate bundle. And we presented those in a controlled lab situation. So that sounds a bit weird, like we put our consumers into a lab. We put them into a computer room and we gave them a device where they could only look at the things that we were telling them to look at. So they filled in some information about who they were, what their dairy consumption was. Then we asked them some basic multiple choice questions to gather some understanding of what they knew of the dairy sector. And then we presented them with the information about these different bundles. And we either presented them with a control set of information, which had nothing in there. We presented them with just a label that told them gave them an indication of kind of efficiency through a percentage greenhouse gas emission reduction thing. We presented them with a poster, or we presented them with a video. And largely speaking, they were slightly, at that point, they were slightly more interested in the nature-based solutions, regardless of how you presented the information to them. But when you presented them with the video-based information, that gave them more information, that increased their knowledge, increased their understanding more, and increased their willingness to pay more. So they would pay a little bit more for all of the innovations. They were slightly more interested in the nature-based, but not significantly so. But when we gave them the video, that gave them a little bit extra, and they increased their willingness to pay for all of the innovations, but still had a slight preference for nature-based solutions.
I mean, there's a huge amount of work in there, isn't there? And a huge amount of information to extract as well. I know we've talked about it, both in terms of the effectiveness of different communication methods with consumers and how they take that information on, and then where they sit in terms of their acceptance of different mitigation approaches. And it's interesting that those nature-based ones, although not statistically significant, sort of sat a little bit above it, and where they felt there was a manipulation of maybe welfare or behavior or the natural processes within the cow, that there might be a little bit more of a reluctance there. That I know that's hugely oversimplifying it, but we'll sort of come back to that, because what I'm interested is to, if we can, Zoe, to flip it round onto Sven in terms of the practical applications of some of those approaches. And I know, Sven, you and I have talked about some of the precision applications, the precision mitigation strategies, like, as Zoe says, getting more out production-wise for lower greenhouse gas emissions proportionally. But also we've talked about some of the future developments building on top of things like estrus and health detection monitors, but some of the genetic developments and how some of the genetics maybe interact with the environment stuff that offers some really exciting developments from a practical perspective. Could we just touch on some of the things that you employ already on the farm at Reading, and then also where you see some of that developing?
Yeah. Thanks, Dan. I would like to sort of split it into two areas. One is let's call it the nature-based farming versus the precision. So I want to just very briefly talk about the former one. Like I said, I've seen various production systems. I've seen various sort of climatic conditions, soil types, performance of grasses, grain varieties, etc. And one of the things that really clarified that for me was coming down here to the southwest of England and having encountered just one season of a significant drought. And just comparing that with the southwest of Scotland, my previous residence, where drought was not really an issue. There was more the sunshine hours. But down here, what I saw, and we have a really large area of cropping and silage land. What I found here is that our yields are probably only 60%, maybe 65 or 70% of what they are in the southwest of Scotland. And that the yields are also obviously compromised strongly by the fact that for 2 to 3 months of the year here last year, there was essentially no rainfall. So we had no growth of anything or of any kind. And that in itself has driven two things. Number one, we had to import more feed concentrates and forages. And number two, you look at the amount of land that you are working with and that you're cultivating, and sometimes there are 10 passes or a dozen passes over a hectare of land. And you start to look at not just the costs, but the impact on soil structure, on organic matter, and you look at the yield component at the end of it, and you quite quickly see that as you need to fulfill the feed demands for your herd, you need to import. You're increasing your carbon footprint straight up. Your efficiency is down. You are basically driving an unsustainable system. So looking at nature-based solutions, you have to look at the system as we currently run it in some of these, I would call them sort of threshold or borderline areas, and say, well, climatically, we are not really in a position anymore to continue with traditional farming practices, which to a degree are questionable anyway. But now they're actually becoming questionable because the yield potential is coming down to a level where economically it doesn't even make sense anymore to pursue some of these techniques. And what I mean by that is you come in every year, you plow a hectare of land, then you power harrow it, and so on. You spray it, you fertilize it, you harvest. Like I said, a dozen passes. And I think we need to become smarter. And I think this is where the University of Reading is well placed to look at some of these borderline type situations where you have land, soils, and climatic conditions which are not ideal. What can you do in these areas to improve performance, and at the same time you actually become more climate neutral, or you're tending towards more climate neutrality? And I think whether you call this regenerative farming or techniques that are quite predominant in other parts of the world where economics play maybe a bigger part in making or having a sustainable farming system, I think these become more and more on-farm decisions because of the economic pressure of deriving productive yield or yield of your land that actually makes sense to involve yourself in the farming activity. So that's one part. The second part, and sorry that I was digressing, I just wanted to sort of clear it in terms of where my head is in terms of thinking of some of these opportunities. The second part is, of course, herd health, herd fertility, and ultimately this is about longevity of your animals. Give a couple of examples, a couple of metrics. On average, the UK farmer, and across the world this doesn't very much, you're replacing 30 to 35% of your herd every year. And there is an argument for and against. The argument against is that you're raising young stock, which themselves leave a footprint behind until they enter the herd. On the other hand, you have genetic gains, which you then convert into some sort of economic profit or into a sustainability parameter that you're aiming for. This could be the EnviroCow index. You're breeding more animals, getting closer to the point where, not that they don't produce methane, enteric methane, but that really scales down to a level where there is a measurable impact. So when you look at that, and whether you say you need a lower replacement rate or a higher replacement rate, leaving that aside, there is a cost in not having longevity in your dairy cows. And anything that you can do to ensure that you're driving the efficiency up, you should consider. It's an economic decision like anything, but there are technologies now available, and they're becoming better and better to help you make better decisions in that respect. So in terms of estrus monitoring or herd health monitoring, you can now run a 1,000-cow farm with a system that tells you on a 24/7 basis at any time of the day what is wrong with your cows. And you can then immediately attend to the cow individually and ensure that you're not compromising any of her KPIs that you're aiming for. And this is the same for estrus detection. 15 years ago, you might have had good herd managers that are very, very efficient, very effective. but the technologies nowadays are so good. Unless you're on farm 24 hours a day, you cannot replicate that anymore. There's just no way. So in terms of the technologies, the precision that is out there, absolutely is where I think you can make gains in that respect, and therefore, because you have better herd performance, you also drive down your carbon footprint through that. On the genetics side, we are genotyping our entire herd, and we've started that in the last 8 months. And we are also starting to look at epigenetics now. And this is obviously, I'm not sure how familiar the people here are. I've learned about this probably in the last 6 months, but to understand how environmental conditions affect whether certain genes are switched on and active, and giving you an idea of whether your management practices need to be changed or can be changed, again, to optimize cow performance from whatever metric you might be considering. So I think the genotyping, absolutely essential. Epigenetics, I'm not too familiar with at this point, and I think there's also an issue still around short-term effects, so short-term changes in terms of a gene might be switched on tomorrow. If you change the environmental conditions, it might be switched off the next day. I think there's still a few unknowns which might be addressed over time.
So there's a few elements there in the building on work as well. So we've still got the nature-based approach, but the point you really hammered home there is it's very context dependent. And so actually looking at something we may have done for a long time or may actually be going on in other parts of the country, other parts of the world, may not be applicable to somebody's individual situation and location, and simply ploughing on with the same sort of input levels in a changing climate may not always be the most appropriate thing for certain farms.
Yes, I would agree. I would agree with that. In a high-performing system where all the conditions are ideal, even there, I would say we can probably adjust our practices either to reduce the carbon footprint or to improve some sort of soil componentry or biodiversity aspect. But certainly in those areas which are much more borderline in terms of economic efficiency, I think to carry on with practices that are high cost, low efficiency, then they're really not meeting any of our sustainability targets any longer. I think those are the ones they're not necessarily the low-hanging fruits, but there's just no way to continue with what we've done or how we've done it in the past. And I think we need to look at alternative models.
Yeah, and so that everyone's a loser in that sort of scenario in terms of financial and outcome based. And so it's taken that integrated approach. Then we have the sort of precision efficiency based things again that Zoe bundled up and you talked about in terms of data. And what is great, I think, about the dairy sector, and this was supported by last month's surgery with some of the IGP work, was that actually the dairy sector was incredibly used to lots of data and lots of data. There's a huge amount of data available. So as a sector, they're really well placed to move that forward, which also brings in skills retention and attracts new people to the industry. And also really have those advancements with respect to not only genetics and genomics, but how the environment and particular environments within farms interact with those genetics and switch them on and off. So there's some exciting developments there. I think getting your...
Sorry, Dan, sorry, you for me, you're breaking up quite a bit at the moment. I don't know if it's the same for everyone else. Not sure.
Yeah, that's never created it when I got one of those I tried. I'll pose the question to Zoe and then I can keep it quiet, I think. So with some of those really good messages we've got that you identified and that Sven's doing in practice, how do we communicate those to the consumer and how might we do that going forward?
Okay, yeah. So I'm not an expert in human behavior change. I have done a little bit of it. We've done a bit of facilitating people and trying to get people, but yeah, we I think so from this study, two things came out. So one, anecdotally, the early group of consumers, some of them did mention the fact that they liked the communication, the sort of personalized communication of messages, the feeling like you were slightly connected to the product. So um, they did buy in to um, having someone's face on a bottle, having a story on the packaging. They were interested in that sort of thing. So those connections are are important. We've got to think about simplifying messages to bring people on board, and also so the slightly more the less anecdotal part of the evidence was that having the extra level of explanation in the video did make a difference. So essentially, the poster and the video contain the same detail, but having someone verbally communicate that message rather than reading it off a poster made a difference to the willingness to pay. It had the stronger impact. Um, so, um, so I think that's an important consideration. There's definitely scope for it, and more than ever, farmers have got a more direct way to communicate with consumers because social media allows you to not have to just wait for AHDB to have a marketing campaign for something. You can actually directly communicate if you want to, and say a bit more. The the we've obviously the thing that we need to think about is communicating those slightly more difficult subjects. So the consumers were initially mixed about the methane mitigation methods. But having said that, they weren't that negative to it, and they still increased their willingness to pay for all three of the bundles in the experiment. We then went on and did a second experiment because obviously we know that what people say in a hypothetical lab situation is different to what their purchasing decision might be. So we did another experiment where we actually parked the nature-based and the precision elements because we knew that at that point in time, farmers themselves were getting on board with the nature-based solutions, and there were various SFIs available to support that. And for the precision-based ones, the technology-based ones, there's usually a payback to the farmer, so they were already on board and finding ways of doing those methods. And the ones where the farmers really were struggling to get on board with were the mitigation ones because there's no direct payback for those to the farmer. They were waiting for, and this came across from all of the four countries, that the idea that actually the government should be taking a very strong line and actually making decisions and driving things came across from all four of the partner countries. The farmers were waiting for that kind of that DEFRA decision on what we should do with regards to Bovaer. Should we be feeding it? Should everybody be putting it in? Those kind of things. So we chose to do those methane based ones in the second experiment. And it was relatively light touch in terms of the way we communicated to the farmer, to the consumer, what we were doing. We literally told them that this product, so we had two different days per location, and one day we told them nothing about the product. We just said, do you want to buy some yogurt? And on the other day, we told them this is yogurt that's been produced using methods to reduce methane emissions and greenhouse gas emissions from cows. And that was it. That was the crux of the message we delivered. And although the willingness to pay was not as great as in the consumer experiments in the lab where we'd given them the extra level of information. It was still in the range of about 35 pence for a litre of milk is what we were asking them. So and we did that in a way where we basically said you're going to have to buy this yogurt with toppings. What are you willing to pay for it? So we asked them their willingness to pay at the beginning, and then told them that if they pulled out a random number from a like a bingo machine, if that number was less than or equal to the amount they told us, then they could buy the yogurt. If the number was greater than what than what they'd said they were willing to pay, then they wouldn't be able to buy the yogurt, so they couldn't go away with it. So they had to put in a number that was plausible and that they were happy to pay, because otherwise, if they did really want the yogurt, they couldn't have it. So they had to choose a number that was sensible. So that's a kind of a method that economists sometimes use to try and weed out willingness to pay in a kind of a slightly less hypothetical sense. So yeah, so we can get information across, and it doesn't have to be too complicated. But if we can personalize it and bring the consumer, get the consumer interested in it, then it potentially has more benefits for you.
So it sounds, I've just turned my camera off to see if this improves the sound. So let me know if it's still bad. But it sounds like actually we're in a really good place, because the consumer is willing to listen even to some of the more challenging approaches to reducing the climatic impact of dairy. But we need to invest some time in communicating those messages and actually helping some of that understanding there, which is great. And also, I know you and I have talked about it, and it's always brought up when investigating the willingness of consumers to pay. What they say in certain circumstances versus what they're actually willing to do is often different. And it looks like what the project aimed to do was to try and separate that and really explore it. Mm-hmm. So I think we're in a great place with respect to speaking to consumers. Sven, just a final question to you. One thing that Zoe touched on there was actually, some of those things that had a direct return, whether that be through additional payments like SFI, farmers were more willing to invest in. And you talked about the economics as well. Is there other barriers or drivers from a farmer perspective that could actually increase the adoption of some of these interventions, whether that be education, peer-to-peer learning, some indirect financial support? What other things might increase the adoption of some of these things by dairy farmers?
I think it's always certainly quite correctly pointed out. I certainly agree with her saying that when it comes to precision technologies, farmers understand the payoff time, or when something breaks even, or when something makes economic sense quite well. So a time horizon of 5 years to 10 years usually is enough. Anything beyond that starts to become, especially if a lot of money is involved or a lot of capital is involved, starts to become more risky because of the uncertainty around it. And I would have thought that some of the mitigating mechanisms on farm, for example, the most simple one is slurry storage when it comes to some of the methane emissions, but some of the infrastructure required is sometimes simply beyond the means if there are competing investment requirements. And a lot of farms are dealing with let's say, old infrastructure. So there's always an upgrade requirement somewhere. And I think it's just the prioritization. Now, if society or the government puts a priority on X, and in this case, it's sustainability, and because when it comes to methane emissions, we're in a fortunate position, but also an unfortunate position. I mean, we are the dairy industry or farming industry. That's the short carbon cycle. So in a way, the impact is, unless there's a change in numbers, is static. But we can pull the methane lever, and that has an immediate impact. So this is of societal consequence and of benefit. So I personally, as a farmer, and I'm not a stakeholder, I don't have skin in the game as such. So maybe my answer is not all that relevant to a true commercial farmer that has capital on the line. But I would say, yes, it makes sense. Absolutely, it's a lever we should pull. But I think because it is a bigger societal matter, and because we can drive a lot of benefit from this, there needs to be support mechanisms for farmers in place to enable that, and to not to that you don't have a situation where you are compromising other investment decisions that make economic sense, and have it to their detriment. So while you might put this cost on the farmer now, there will be a longer term detrimental impact on the economics of that farm, because it's all a trade-off. These are all competing interests, and that's what I think where society and the government needs to focus a bit more strongly on. This is very layman's term point of view, so not an expert. Yeah.
And I just jump back in, Dan. Yeah, that message of consistency in the policy side of things came across not only from all the countries, but also very much around this measure, that you need to know where things are going to be able to make decisions, especially on a dairy farm where what you do today is about the future replacement for 2.5 years down the line. It's you need to have so this project happened. It started in 2021, I think, or 22. So we've had government change and significant policy uncertainty in that period of time. We've had things removed, reinstated in terms of payments from the beginning of the project to the end.
Yeah, there's certain themes that come through in all of our discussions, I think, irrespective of sector and topic, and they are that sort of shared risk and responsibility. So Sven, as we've discussed in the past, without financial sustainability, then we don't have any other sustainability. And actually, if there's levers that we can pull that may be not directly impact farm profitability, but have much wider societal good, then that risk and responsibility needs to be shared. And then Zoe, exactly that point, that there needs to be consistency and long-term views to allow farmers to make those business decisions to the benefit of both their businesses, climate, and wider society as well. So these sort of constant themes we have coming through that hopefully we keep banging the drum and they get through. But already we've come to the end of our session this morning. That's flown by. I could talk about dairy all day. Zoe, we haven't even touched on climate impacts on dairy systems, the other way around. So I think that's something we should revisit, particularly as your work gains greater clarity. Sven, thank you for all your input as well. It's great to hear it from the sort of the ground as well, particularly bringing your international experience to it as well. So thank you everyone for joining. Apologies for the tech issues, whether it's been better without my faith on there from a tech perspective. And we will send you details of when the recording's available and also let you know of the next session as well. So thank you all for joining and have a great weekend.